Nobody was safe in that room. Not the man holding the cards, not the men pretending they weren't scared, and definitely not the ones thinking about making a move too early. I already knew who was lying before the coffee cooled. That's the thing about power, real power. You don't feel it when people raise their voices. You feel it when the room goes quiet and nobody wants to blink first. Harlem in those days wasn't just blocks and buildings. It was a system. A breathing machine that punished mistakes and rewarded patience. And I sat at the center of it not because I was the loudest, but because I listened longer than everyone else. The streets thought I ruled with muscle. Downtown thought I ruled with money. Both were wrong. I ruled because I understood timing, and timing was everything. See, when you survive long enough, you learn something dangerous. Enemies don't usually come for you with guns first. They come with smiles, with favors, with silence that lasts a little too long. By the mid-50s, every badge, every judge, every politician who mattered had already chosen their side. Some stood with me openly, most stood with me quietly, and the ones who didn't, they didn't last long enough to complain. I kept Harlem balanced, food on tables, rent paid when the city looked the other way. Children sent to school so they didn't have to learn the alphabet from a police blotter. That wasn't charity, that was insurance. Respect is cheaper than bullets and it travels further. At home, everything looked clean, polished, safe. A king's house built on discipline and appearances. The kind of place where nothing dirty ever crossed the threshold, at least not where people could see it. That mattered, because the street doesn't forgive hypocrisy, not from its enemies and not from its heroes. My wife understood that better than anyone. She didn't just protect my name. She guarded the idea of it, the symbol. The reason people believed the game could be played with rules, and for a long time it worked. Then curiosity came knocking, not with a gun, not with a threat, with questions. She didn't belong uptown, didn't smell like the street, didn't move like someone who knew when to look away. She carried paper instead of steel, and she thought that made her dangerous. Most people who came looking for me wanted a headline or a warning. She wanted understanding. That's how it starts. Not with desire, with recognition. She expected an animal. She found a man who read before he spoke. A man who knew that every empire collapses the moment it forgets how it was built. And that's when I made my first mistake. I let the conversation last too long. Words turned into meetings. Meetings turned into habits. Habits turned into exposure. I built walls everywhere else. But in one quiet corner of the city, I let my guard down. Just enough for the wrong people to notice. Because here's the truth nobody tells you about ruling anything. You don't fall when you're weak. You fall when you think you've already won. I didn't know it yet, but a clock had started ticking. And it wasn't counting seconds. It was counting leverage. And somewhere beyond Harlem, far from the streets that protected me, a secret was forming that could tear the whole board apart. I could feel it. That pressure behind the eyes. That silence before the storm. The kind that only shows up right before everything you control becomes something someone else can use against you. And this time, it wasn't coming for me first. Part 2. By the time I understood what I'd invited into my life, it wasn't romance anymore. It was risk wearing perfume. That woman didn't just want a story. She wanted the part of me Harlem never got to touch. The private thoughts, the doubts, the corners of the mind you don't show the street because the street will use them like a blade. And I let her close enough to see them. That's on me. We didn't meet where anybody could see. Not the clubs I owned. Not the rooms where my name carried weight. Neutral ground. A place with a doorman who understood cash and didn't ask questions twice. Inside those walls, the world felt suspended. Like the rules outside didn't apply. Like the colors and the headlines and the whispers stayed on the sidewalk. But you don't get to pause reality. You only get to ignore it until it collects interest. Every time we crossed paths, something got heavier. Not the lust, the consequence, because in my world, secrets are never truly private. They just have smaller audiences. Harlem would have taken it as betrayal, not because of love, but because of symbolism. I was supposed to be a certain kind of man to them, a standard, a shield. Downtown would have turned her into ash, not with bullets, with disgrace, with paper and polite smiles while they destroyed her life. And the Italians, they would have smiled the whole time, because they don't care about morals, they care about pressure points. Their truce with me was real, but it wasn't warm. It was the kind of agreement you make with a man you respect and plan to cut later when the knife presents itself. And I knew that, so I kept my face clean, my routine tight, no loose ends, no unnecessary movement. But there's one thing even a disciplined man can't control, a mistake that breathes. The night she told me, she didn't cry, didn't dramatize it. She just sat there with her hands folded like she'd already accepted her fate. "I'm late," she said. I didn't move at first. I didn't speak, I didn't even blink. I'd been in rooms where men begged for their lives. I'd watched people die over less than a bad look. But that sentence, that simple sentence, put ice in my chest. A mistress is a fire you can smother. A child is smoke that travels. A child meant records, doctors, question, a future that couldn't be controlled with threats and payoffs. And in that era with those parents, that child wasn't just a baby. It was evidence. It was scandal. It was a hostage waiting to happen. I saw it all in a flash, like a man seeing his own funeral before he hits the ground. A knock at the wrong door. A photograph passed across the wrong table. A priest, a cop, a gangster, it didn't matter who got to it first. Because once they knew, I wouldn't just lose face. I'd lose the board, so I did what I always did when the world tried to corner me. I didn't panic, I planned. Not with my usual people, not with my street soldiers and loud talkers. This wasn't a job for men who brag about loyalty. This was a job for men who live in ledgers and signatures. Men who could disappear money, move property, invent a life on paper so clean it looked like God wrote it himself. I built a shadow world, not for me, for them. A house far from Harlem. A place where neighbors don't ask questions because they're too busy protecting their own lives. A new name for her. A story with enough polish to survive polite scrutiny. And when the time came, there were no hospitals, no clipboards, no public records. Just a private doctor with shaky hands and a stronger fear of death than of God. I was there when the boy took his first breath. I stood in the corner, quiet, like a stranger at my own miracle. When he cried, something in me softened for half a second. Then the reality came back and tightened its grip. I gave him a name that felt like strength. And then I erased him, not out of cruelty, out of survival, because the only way that child lived was if nobody ever connected him to me. For years after that, I ran 2 lives like a man balancing knives. In Harlem, I was exactly who I needed to be. My wife saw the face the city expected, the husband, the pillar, the man whose house stayed clean even when the streets outside ran dirty. But once a week I vanished. No entourage. No familiar driver. No recognizable car. Just a plain ride in a quiet road north where the skyline fell behind me and the air started smelling like trees instead of trouble. And in that other house for a few hours I wasn't a king. I was just a man sitting on the floor with a boy who looked at me like I was the whole world. That's the part people don't understand. The part that makes you careless. Because love doesn't just warm you, it distracts you. And while I was out there playing father in a world that wasn't mine. Back in Harlem, the one person I trusted most started noticing the missing pieces. My wife didn't accuse, didn't confront. She simply watched. And when a woman like that goes quiet, it's not peace. It's calculation, because she was learning my pattern. And the moment someone learns your pattern, they can predict your weakness. And that's when the real danger started creeping in. Not from a rival with a gun, but from a file with my name on it, moving across a federal desk, like a death sentence wearing a suit. Part 3. Prison doesn't change a man, it reveals him. When they finally put the cuffs on me, it wasn't loud. No chaos. No headlines screaming my name the way people expected, just paperwork, cold smiles. A verdict already decided long before I walked into the room. They didn't send me away to punish me. They sent me away to isolate me. And isolation is where secrets start bleeding. Before I turned myself in, I drove north one last time. Didn't bring muscle, didn't bring speeches. Just truth wrapped in promises I wasn't sure I could keep. She was scared, not panicked. Scared in that quiet way that tells you a person's been thinking too much, sleeping too little, watching the windows at night. The boy was bigger now, smarter, eyes too observant for his age. That scared me more than anything. I told her the money would keep coming, that the paper men would follow instructions, that nothing would change. Those were the lies a man tells when he has no other weapons left. I knelt down in front of the boy, told him I had business to handle far away. Didn't say where, didn't say why. You don't teach a child the word prison unless you want it to live in his mouth forever. Then I walked away. Bars closed behind me on the other side of the country, and the silence hit different out there. Not the city silence, not the kind you can buy your way through. This was the kind designed to grind you down. Letters started coming, too many. Too detailed, stories about school, about scraped knees, about questions she didn't know how to answer anymore. Pictures too, and I knew better. I knew paper trails were how men like me got buried, but you tell yourself you'll destroy them later. You tell yourself one more look won't hurt. That's how the cracks form. I hid them where I thought nobody would look. A false bottom, a small lie inside a bigger one. Years passed. The world outside shifted. The streets got louder, meaner, less patient. When they finally let me walk free, Harlem felt familiar and wrong at the same time. Like a suit that still fit but carried the weight of old blood. They welcomed me back like a symbol, like a myth that refused to die. My wife stood beside me, flawless as ever, strong, unreadable, and I thought I'd made it through clean. I brought my trunk home, told myself I'd handle it, burn the evidence, seal the past, but power doesn't wait for closure. Meetings stacked up. Old alliances needed rebalancing. New wolves wanted to test the fence. And in that noise, I made the kind of mistake only tired men make. I left the trunk unlocked. The rain came down hard that Tuesday, the kind that makes the city feel trapped in its own skin. I was out holding court, letting people see me alive and in control. At home, my wife decided it was time to clean. She didn't go looking for answers. She simply followed instinct, and instinct led her straight to the bottom, when her fingers found what didn't belong. When she saw the handwriting that wasn't mine. When she turned over a photograph and recognized a face she knew too well. Something shifted in that apartment that no gun could ever fix. She didn't scream, didn't cry. She put everything back exactly where she found it. That's what scared me later when I realized, because rage is loud, grief is messy, but patience means someone is thinking. And while I was busy fighting for territory, believing the danger was still on the street, my wife was sitting alone, holding a truth big enough to destroy everything I'd built. And worse than that, she could already feel that someone else knew too. Somewhere beyond Harlem, a pair of eyes was watching the wrong house, and the game was about to stop being personal. Part 4. She didn't confront me right away. That's how I knew this wasn't about emotion anymore. For 2 days, she moved through the house like nothing had changed. Same routines, same tone, same discipline, but her eyes were somewhere else, measuring distance, weighing outcomes. I've sat across from killers who hid their intentions worse. She was more dangerous than all of them. While I was out reminding Harlem, who still held the reins, she was already moving pieces I didn't know were in play. Quietly, off the books, without touching a single man who answered to me. That alone should tell you how serious it was. She went as someone from before the empire had a name. A man who lived between shadows, who knew how to watch without being seen. No threats, no drama, just instructions. Watch the house, count the cars, tell me if anyone else is counting too. The call came sooner than expected. There were men parked down the road, not law, not ours. That's when the situation stopped being a secret and turned into a crisis, because the Italians didn't guess. They didn't assume, they confirmed. They saw what I tried to hide and understood immediately what it was worth. A child doesn't just change a man, it gives his enemies a handle. That night when I walked through my front door, the lights were low, too low. She was sitting in the chair like she'd been there for hours, still wearing her coat. No anger, no tears, just resolve. She didn't say my name, didn't raise her voice. She placed the photograph between us like a weapon she didn't need to fire. For the first time in decades, I had no move ready. I told her the truth, not the excuses, not the justifications, the truth. And she listened like a general hearing a battlefield report. Then she gave me hers, men watching the house, waiting, studying. And in that moment, shame burned off and survival took over. I wanted to move fast, too fast. She stopped me without touching me. "You leave tonight," she said, "and they'll know exactly where to strike." She was right. Every street eye was already on me. Any sudden shift, any break in pattern, and the wolves would sprint. Then she said something I wasn't ready for. "I'll go." I saw the whole thing in her face before she finished speaking. She wasn't asking, she was already gone. No soldiers, no guns, no noise, just a woman no one would notice driving north while all eyes stayed locked on me. I didn't argue long. That's another thing people misunderstand. When you trust someone completely, you don't fight their clarity. Hours later, rain swallowed the roads, and somewhere between states she drove straight into an ambush that wasn't meant for her. Shotguns, headlights, metal screaming against metal. She didn't slow down, didn't freeze. She drove like someone who understood that hesitation kills faster than bullets. When the call finally came, her voice was steady. They were safe. Barely, but that wasn't the end. That was the warning shot. Because once blood gets spilled over leverage, nobody walks away satisfied. The Italians had shown their hand, and now they knew something worse. They knew my wife wasn't just a symbol, she was a player. And men like that don't forgive being outmaneuvered. They wait, they adjust, and they come back quieter. Somewhere in the dark, someone was already planning the next move. And this time, it wasn't going to be a chase. Part 5. By morning, the city thought everything was normal. That's how you know something's wrong. Harlem was loud the way it always was. Shoes on pavement, music bleeding out of open windows, men laughing too hard like they needed witnesses. But underneath it, the air was tight. The Italians didn't retaliate. No bodies dropped. No messages sent. That silence wasn't respect, it was recalculation. They'd lost their chance at a clean grab, but now they knew two things for certain. One, the boy existed. Two, my household wasn't united the way they thought. That second detail, that's gold in our line of work. I stayed visible, too visible. Every club, every sit-down, every hand shaken in public just a second longer than necessary. I made sure anyone watching saw a man comfortable in his skin. Meanwhile, my wife disappeared from Harlem without anyone noticing. No calls, no witnesses, no trail. That bothered people. Men started asking questions they pretended weren't questions. Everything good at home? Queen doing all right? I smiled, I nodded, and I logged every name because curiosity is never harmless. It's a symptom. The safe house in Jersey was quiet, but quiet doesn't mean secure. Quiet just means the danger hasn't announced itself yet. The boy didn't understand why he couldn't go outside, why the windows stayed covered, why every sound made his mother flinch. My wife understood all of it. She watched him sleep one night and realized something I hadn't yet said out loud. This wasn't temporary. You don't dodge the mob once and go back to brunch. You don't outrun leverage and then slow down, so she made another move. One I hadn't approved, one I hadn't even considered. She started closing doors behind me. Accounts shifted. Contacts went silent. Old escape routes quietly burned. She was making sure there was only one way forward. And when I finally realized what she was doing, it hit me harder than any betrayal. She wasn't protecting my secret anymore. She was ending it, not with violence, with distance, with disappearance so complete that even my enemies wouldn't believe it was real. That night, I stood alone in my apartment, city lights flickering like nervous eyes. I understood something then that most men learn too late. Power doesn't get taken from you all at once. It gets reduced, piece by piece, option by option, until the only move left is the one that hurts the most. Somewhere a phone was going to ring, not with a threat, not with a warning, with a choice. And when it did, I already knew what it was going to cost me. Because the game had reached the point where nobody wins anymore. They just survive longer than the truth, and I could feel it closing in. Part 6. The call came just after midnight. Not to my phone, not to the house. A pay phone 3 blocks off Lenox. The kind that only rings when somebody wants to make sure you understand how small the circle has become. I didn't answer right away. That pause, that's leverage too. When I picked up, there was no greeting. No accent thick enough to announce itself, just breathing on the other end. measured, confident. They didn't threaten me. They didn't have to. They spoke like men who already owned the ending, just waiting to see how much pain I wanted on the way there. They knew the boy was gone. They knew the house was empty. They knew who moved him. That part mattered. It meant this wasn't about the child anymore. It was about control. You see, when men like that fail once, they don't double down. They reframe the game. They don't want the leverage back. They want to remind you that they can still reach you. Anytime, anywhere. I hung up without saying a word. Back home, I sat in the dark and understood the full shape of what I'd lost. Not territory, not money, predictability. My wife had done something brilliant and unforgivable at the same time. She made the boy untouchable by making him unreachable, which meant the only thing left on the board that could bleed was me. The streets felt it before I said a word. Deals slowed. Meetings got shorter. Men who used to linger started excusing themselves early. Not fear, evaluation. They were watching to see if the king still had vision, or if he was ruling on memory. I met my wife again days later. No witnesses, no softness. She didn't apologize. She told me what was already done. New names, new country, new future, no letters, no calls, no photographs, a clean erasure. She didn't ask for permission. She gave me reality. I wanted to argue. I wanted to remind her who built this world, but the truth sat heavier than pride. She saved the boy, and in doing so, she'd stripped me of the last illusion I had left. That I could protect everything. When we parted, she didn't say goodbye. She said, "They'll test you now." She was right. Because once your enemies realize you chose sacrifice over dominance, they stop fearing you. They start studying you. And somewhere in the city, behind closed doors and whispered deals, men were already asking the same question. Not if I was still powerful, but how much pain it would take to prove it. I walked back into Harlem knowing the next move wouldn't come from me. It would come for me. And when it did, it wouldn't be subtle. Part 7. They didn't rush it. That's what told me this wasn't street business anymore. When the street wants blood, it spills fast. Messy, public, loud enough to make a point. This was different. This was patience wearing a suit. Weeks passed. No hits, no warnings, no disrespect. On the surface, Harlem stayed in line. Underneath, things shifted just enough to be wrong. A delivery late by an hour. A lookout replaced without asking. A sit-down canceled for no reason that made sense. Little things. The kind of things you ignore if you want to believe you're still ahead. I didn't ignore them. I started moving leaner, cutting conversations short, testing loyalty without announcing it. Some men passed. Some failed without realizing they'd been tested. And then there were the ones who didn't show up at all. That's when I knew the Italians weren't coming at me head-on. They were starving the space around me, making people nervous about being seen too close. Making allies wonder if proximity came with a cost. Fear doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers until everyone leans away at the same time. I adjusted. I always do. But there's a moment in every long game where you feel it. That subtle click when the board changes shape. It happened one night at a restaurant I'd eaten at for years. Same booth, same waiter, different eyes in the room. Nobody reached for a weapon. Nobody blocked the exit. They didn't need to. They let me finish my meal. That was the message. On the walkout, I felt it in my chest. Not panic, not anger, clarity. This wasn't about the boy anymore. That chapter was closed. This was about punishment, not death. Legacy. They wanted to see how a king moves when the future's already been written without him. I went home and sat alone, lights off, city humming outside like it always had. I thought about everything I'd built, everything I'd hidden, everything I'd sacrificed, and I realized something most men never admit to themselves. The game doesn't end when you lose. It ends when you stop being useful. Somewhere, someone was deciding whether I was still necessary or just expensive to keep alive. And when that decision came down, I wouldn't hear it, I'd feel it. Part 8. Usefulness is a quiet currency. You don't hear it being traded. You just notice when the doors stop opening the same way. I felt it in the handshakes, firm but shorter. In the way men started standing instead of sitting when I walked in. Respect without comfort, that's a warning. I still had Harlem, but Harlem was changing. Younger, hungrier, less sentimental about who built what. They didn't remember the wars, they remembered the money. And money doesn't care about legacy. I tightened the circle again. Only men who'd bled with me. Men who understood patience the way older men do because impatience already buried their friends. Even then, something kept slipping through. Information doesn't leak the way water does. It leaks the way smoke does. You don't see the hole, you just smell it. I started hearing my name in rooms I wasn't invited to anymore. Not spoken with fear, spoken with calculation. That's worse. One night, a man I'd protected for years crossed the street to avoid me. Didn't look back. That told me everything. The Italians weren't trying to kill me. They were making sure nobody would die for me. And that's how you end a king without firing a shot. I went home late, poured a drink I didn't finish, and stood by the window. Same city, same lights, different weight. I thought about the boy, not his face. His future clean, unmarked, free of my shadow. That had been the right move, but right moves don't always save you. Sometimes they just decide who survives after you're gone. The phone rang once, stopped, didn't ring again. That wasn't a wrong number, that was a check-in. I didn't pick it up. I already knew what was coming next. When the city stops testing you, when your enemies stop reacting, that's when they've already agreed on the outcome, and the only question left is timing. I set the glass down untouched. Tomorrow I'd walk back into Harlem like nothing had changed. Same posture, same calm, because panic gives men permission. But deep down I understood something I'd never had to face before. The board was still in front of me. The pieces were still standing. But the hands deciding the endgame weren't mine anymore. Part 9. The next day I made myself visible on purpose. Same streets, same stops, same pace. You don't hide when men are deciding your value. You remind them what they're measuring. Faces turned, heads nodded. Nobody smiled too wide. That told me enough. Power doesn't disappear, it relocates. And right now it was hovering, waiting to see if I still deserved it. I held court like I always had. Short conversations, long silences. Letting men talk themselves into revealing what they thought I couldn't hear anymore. A few were loyal. A few were scared. Most were undecided. That's the dangerous middle. Late afternoon, I caught a look between two men who used to avoid eye contact around me. Now they shared it. Confirmation doesn't need words. That night I didn't go home right away. I walked, let the city breathe around me. Harlem has a sound when it's thinking, not the music, not the sirens, the pause between them. I felt eyes tracking me that didn't belong to the street, not sloppy enough to be amateurs, not close enough to be a hit. Observers. I smiled to myself. So this was the phase we were in. Measure, delay, wait for the man to make a mistake out of exhaustion. I wouldn't give them that. But as I turned the corner toward my building, something shifted. Not outside, inside. A sense I hadn't felt since the first time I ever held real power. That cold clarity. The understanding that no matter how smart you are, no matter how far ahead you think, the game always collects its due. I stopped at the door and didn't go in right away. Sometimes the smartest move is knowing when the room on the other side has already changed. Because once you step through, there's no stepping back. And I knew deep down that whatever waited inside wasn't there to negotiate. Part 10. I went inside anyway. That's the part nobody understands. You don't survive as long as I did by hesitating at doorways. The apartment was quiet, too quiet for a place that had once been the nerve center of an empire. No radio, no movement, just the hum of the city leaking in through the windows like static. Nothing was out of place, and that's what made it wrong. A clean room is only comforting when you expect it to be clean. I poured a drink I didn't need and sat down, without turning my back to the hallway. Old habits don't die, they sharpen. That's when I noticed it. The chair across from me had been moved, just a few inches, not enough for most men to care, enough for me to know someone had been there, not to steal, not to kill, to remind. That's a message only professionals send. I didn't reach for my gun. If they wanted me dead, I wouldn't be standing there finishing a thought. They wanted me awake. Minutes passed, maybe more. Then the phone rang, this time inside the house. I answered. No voice. Just breathing again. Then a sentence spoken slow, careful. You raised the boy to disappear. I didn't respond. Another pause. Now you get to practice. The line went dead. I sat there long after the sound faded, understanding exactly what they meant. They weren't coming for my territory. They weren't coming for my money. They were coming for my presence, forcing me smaller, quieter, less central, a king in name only. That's how they planned to finish it, not with blood, with irrelevance. I stood up and walked to the window, looking down at Harlem glowing back at me like it always had, still alive, still watching. The city didn't know it yet, but a decision had been made somewhere above the street level. And once those kinds of decisions get signed, you don't fight them head on, you don't beg, you wait. Because even when the board isn't yours anymore, a man who sees the whole game can still choose where it breaks. And the next move, it wasn't going to be loud, it was going to be final. Part 11. Final doesn't always mean fast. That's another thing people get wrong. When a man like me decides something is ending, he doesn't rush it. He studies the exit the same way he studied the entrance. For days, I changed nothing. Same routes, same habits, same public face. I wanted them comfortable. Men make mistakes when they think the work is already done. Behind that calm, I was trimming myself down, reducing surface area. Conversations got shorter. Meetings got fewer. I started letting other names carry weight in rooms where mine used to land first. Not surrender. Delegation, there's a difference. Because when you step back without announcing it, people reveal what they really want. Who rushes forward, who hesitates, who pretends not to notice the shift. I saw the future lining itself up without asking me, and I let it. That's what hurt the most, not losing power, but realizing how many men were ready to inherit it the moment they thought I was tired. One night, my wife looked at me across the room and didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. She already knew the direction this was going. "You don't disappear loud," she said quietly. "You disappear clean." I nodded, because if the Italians wanted me reduced, I'd make sure they never got the satisfaction of watching me fall. No spectacle, no funeral they could count as a win, just absence. But absence creates its own danger. Because when a powerful man goes quiet, people don't relax. They get nervous. They start wondering what he knows that they don't. And somewhere in some back room, someone was already asking the wrong question. Not where did he go, but what did he leave behind? That's when I felt it again, that familiar tightening. Because the most dangerous moment in any game is when everyone thinks it's already over. And I knew, deep in my bones, the next move wouldn't be mine. It would be the one that decided whether my silence was respected or challenged. Silence makes people careless. They start filling it with guesses, with plans that only work if you're truly gone. I stayed still long enough for rumors to grow legs. Some said I was sick. Some said I was tired. Some said I'd lost my edge and didn't know it yet. None of those were dangerous. What worried me were the men who stopped talking altogether. That meant decisions were being made without noise. I got confirmation from a place I didn't expect. A man who'd once crossed me and lived only because I allowed it. He didn't come in person, didn't call. He sent a message through someone else, thin and precise. "They think you're done choosing." That's how I knew the clock had reset. Because when your enemies believe you're finished thinking, they stop defending themselves. I walked Harlem that night without protection, not to prove anything, to listen. Corners whispered differently, not fearful, anticipatory. Like a crowd waiting for the lights to go out. I understood then what the Italians had miscalculated. They thought breaking my presence meant breaking my influence. They didn't understand that my power had never lived in rooms. It lived in foresight. I didn't need to strike back. I didn't need to reclaim anything. I needed one thing only, for the right man. To move too early. And before dawn, someone did. A meeting scheduled without my name on it. A territory discussed like it was already vacant. A promise made that assumed I wouldn't object. That's the moment the game reveals itself. I stood at the window again, watching the city breathe, and felt calm settle in where anger should have been, because now I knew. They weren't erasing me. They were rushing to replace me, and replacements always expose themselves. The question wasn't whether I'd step back into the light. The question was how much darkness I'd let fall first. Somewhere, a door was opening that shouldn't have been touched yet. And whoever walked through it Was about to learn the difference between a man who's finished and a man who's been waiting. Part 13. I didn't stop the meeting. That's important. A man who interrupts reveals urgency. Urgency tells people you're afraid of what they'll decide without you. I let it happen. Different room, different names, same hunger. They sat around the table like pioneers carving land that still had my fingerprints all over it, smiling too easy, talking too loud. That's how you know someone thinks the crown's already on their head. I listened from a distance, not through wires, through people. There's always someone who talks too much after the third drink, always someone who wants credit for being early. The plan wasn't elegant. That surprised me. They weren't trying to overthrow anything. They were trying to normalize my absence. That's more dangerous because coups get noticed. Transitions get accepted. They spoke about new stability, about modern arrangements, about how Harlem needed to move forward without ghosts. That word stuck with me. Ghosts. They thought I'd become one. That night I made my first move in weeks. Not violent, not loud. I picked up the phone and made 3 calls, not to soldiers, not to bosses, to men who write things down. By morning, paperwork stalled. Licenses paused. Accounts froze mid-breath. Nothing illegal, nothing traceable, just enough friction to remind everyone how much of the machine still ran through memory. Confusion spread fast, faster than fear. Phones started ringing again. Questions resurfaced. And then I did something deliberate. I showed up, not to the meeting, not to make a speech. I walked into a place where nobody expected to see me anymore and ordered coffee like it was any other day. The room didn't stop moving. It hesitated. That hesitation, that's power returning to its seat. I didn't threaten anyone, didn't correct a single lie. I let them feel the weight of realizing they'd misjudged timing. Because timing isn't about clocks, it's about patience. As I stood there sipping slowly, I understood the truth of it all. They weren't scared of me being alive. They were scared of not knowing when I'd decide to matter again. And now they knew. I paid my bill, nodded once, walked out. Behind me, conversations restarted too fast, too forced. That told me everything. Someone was going to overreact. Someone was going to try to finish what they'd started. And when that happened, I wouldn't need to be visible at all. Because the most dangerous man in the room is the one everyone thought had already left. Part 14. Overreaction always comes dressed as confidence. Within 2 days, the balance tilted too far, too fast. A man started talking like the future belonged to him already, calling meetings he didn't have the weight to call, promising protection he couldn't personally deliver. That's not ambition. That's panic pretending to be courage. I didn't correct him, didn't warn him. Men like that hang themselves with momentum. Instead, I watched how others reacted, who leaned in, who leaned back, who suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere. Because when someone moves too fast, the room tells you whether it's fear or opportunity driving them. And this room smelled like regret waiting to happen. The Italians noticed it too. I could feel it in the way pressure returned to old channels, soft inquiries, side conversations. They were wondering if this man was useful or expendable. That's the danger of stepping into a space that isn't empty yet. You don't just inherit the throne. You inherit the enemies circling it. I stayed silent. Silence is cruel when people want reassurance. Then late one night, I got word of something small, too small to matter to anyone else. A car seen twice in the same place. A conversation cut short when a certain name was mentioned. A meeting rescheduled for no clear reason. That's not coincidence. That's preparation. I sat alone and allowed myself one honest thought. If they were moving now, it meant they thought I wouldn't stop it, which meant they were either very confident or very wrong. I didn't reach for the phone, didn't give instructions. I waited, because the next move wouldn't reveal who was brave. It would reveal who was impatient. And impatience always leaves fingerprints. Somewhere in the city, a decision was being made in a hurry, a shortcut chosen, a line crossed too soon. I could feel it the way you feel a storm before the rain. The board was about to snap back, and whoever thought they were ready for that moment was about to find out how heavy silence really is. Part 15. Impatience showed itself just after dusk. Not with noise, with confidence that hadn't been earned. The man everyone was watching made his move too clean, too public, like someone who wanted witnesses instead of protection. He walked into a room that wasn't his yet and spoke like it was. Names dropped, promises made, lines drawn that didn't belong to him. That's when I knew he'd already lost. Because men who truly inherit power don't announce it. They let others say it for them. I didn't stop him. I didn't counter. I let the city do what it always does to men who reach early. Phones went unanswered. Seats went empty. Support thinned without explanation. By the end of the week, the same people who nodded at him stopped standing too close. That's the first cut. Social isolation. The second cut came quieter. A deal he'd bragged about stalled. A protection promise got tested by the wrong people. Nothing catastrophic, just enough pressure to expose how thin his armor really was. That's when he panicked. And panic makes men sloppy. He started asking questions he shouldn't ask, about me, about where I stood, about whether I was really finished. Those questions traveled back to me faster than he expected. I didn't answer them. Instead, I let one message slip through the cracks. Not a threat, not a denial, just presence. Enough to remind him that I was still thinking. That night he made a call he couldn't take back. Not to the Italians, to someone lower, someone eager. That told me everything. Because when a man skips steps, he's already accepted the risk. I stood at the window again, city spread out below me, calm settling in like it always did right before something broke. I wasn't angry. I wasn't vindictive. I was finished waiting. Somewhere a door had been opened without permission. And the man who opened it believed he was stepping into opportunity. He was. He was stepping into a vacuum, and vacuums don't scream. They collapse. Whatever happened next wouldn't need my voice, just my timing, and timing has never failed me yet. Part 16. The collapse didn't make a sound at first. That's how you know it's real. 1 minute the man was still being mentioned, not praised, mentioned. The next minute his name stopped traveling. That's worse than disrespect. That's erasure in progress. I didn't touch him. Didn't send anyone near him. Didn't have to. The vacuum did the work for me. Protection thinned. Routes changed. Doors that used to open on sight suddenly needed confirmation. Men like that feel it in their gut before they admit it in their head. That sinking understanding that they moved too soon and now the floor is missing. He started drinking more, talking faster, showing up uninvited, all the signs. And then he made the mistake I'd been waiting for. He tried to secure safety by buying certainty. You never do that through the side door. The Italians didn't need him. They needed an example. A man who overreached, exposed himself, and proved that the board was still dangerous without me even touching it. They let him talk, let him think, let him believe. That meeting didn't end in blood. Not right away. It ended in permission. The kind that travels quietly and gets carried out by men who don't ask questions because they don't need to. When I heard where he was headed that night, I didn't intervene. That wasn't cruelty. That was order being restored. Because the city had to see something, not that I was ruthless. But that rushing the future had consequences. I stayed home. Lights low. No calls made. Somewhere, footsteps were echoing down the wrong hallway. Somewhere a man was realizing too late that silence had teeth. I didn't need to know the details. I already knew the outcome. By morning, Harlem would be balanced again. But balance always comes with a cost, and I could feel it settling now. That familiar weight, because every correction leaves a mark, and this one. This one wasn't done writing yet. Part 17. By sunrise, nobody asked questions. That's how you know the city understood. No explanations were offered, no condolences sent. The man's name didn't come up in conversation, not even as a warning. He'd been absorbed. Harlem does that when it needs to correct itself. People went back to business like a muscle relaxing after a spasm. Routes reopened. Calls returned. Confidence crept back into voices that had been measuring silence a little too closely. From the outside, it looked like stability. From where I stood, it looked like acceptance. But acceptance doesn't mean peace. It means people have updated their math. The Italians pulled back just enough to signal satisfaction, not friendship, acknowledgement. They'd tested the waters. The waters had answered. I didn't celebrate, didn't move back into the center. That would have been a mistake. Instead, I stayed exactly where I was, visible enough to matter, distant enough to be inconvenient. That's the position men hate dealing with, because they can't tell if you're finished, or just letting them hang themselves slowly. My wife watched me that morning without speaking. She already knew what the night had done. Something had been restored, something else had been permanently lost. Power always leaves a scar when it comes back. Later that day, I walked the neighborhood alone. No rush, no destination. Men nodded with relief now, not fear. That's different. Fear keeps people sharp. Relief makes them careless. I logged that too, because the game never truly ends. It just changes the tempo. And as I turned down a familiar block, I felt it again. That low pressure behind the eyes. The sense that somewhere someone was learning from what just happened. Not reacting, learning. That's the kind of enemy you don't hear coming. And while Harlem settled back into rhythm, I understood one last truth. The board had corrected itself, but the cost wasn't finished collecting. Some debts don't come due immediately. They wait. And I could already feel one counting the days. Part 18. Debts that wait are the most dangerous ones. They don't knock. They don't announce themselves. They sit somewhere quiet, growing interest. I felt it in the way new faces studied old corners, in how younger men started asking smarter questions, not loud ones, careful ones. That's evolution. The city hadn't turned on me. It had moved past needing me the way it once did. And that's not betrayal. That's time. I still had influence, still had reach, but I no longer had inevitability. That's the part nobody prepares you for. The moment when the future no longer assumes you'll be in it. One afternoon, I got a message that wasn't meant to scare me. It was meant to inform me. A deal had gone through without my blessing. Clean, efficient, no insult attached. That's worse than disrespect. It meant they weren't trying to replace me anymore. They were learning how to operate without me. I sat with that longer than I should have, because a man can survive being challenged. He can even survive being opposed. What breaks him is being unnecessary. My wife noticed the shift before I spoke it. "You're thinking too far ahead," she said softly. I shook my head. "No," I told her. "I'm thinking exactly where I am." That night I didn't sleep. Not from fear, from clarity. There are only 3 ways a man like me leaves the board: in a box, in disgrace, or by choosing the moment himself, and I wasn't ready for the first 2. Somewhere a younger mind was studying the same patterns I once did, watching how power bends, learning when silence matters more than force. I didn't know his name yet, but I could feel him. And that's when I understood the final danger. Not that someone wanted me gone, but that someone was preparing to move. After I did, which meant the next decision I made wouldn't just define my ending. It would decide who inherited the game. I met him without meaning to. That's how the dangerous ones do it. They don't announce themselves. They drift close enough to be noticed only after they've learned something. He wasn't loud, wasn't flashy, didn't talk over people to prove he belonged. He listened. I saw him twice in the same week. Different corners, same stillness. Young but not reckless. Eyes that didn't chase approval. Hands that stayed calm even when the room shifted. That told me everything. He wasn't studying me. He was studying the gaps around me. That's the mistake I made once, a lifetime ago. When we finally spoke, it wasn't about business. It was about nothing important. That's how you test intelligence. You see what a man does when there's nothing to gain. He didn't reach, didn't flatter, didn't ask for proximity. He left when the moment ended. That night, I understood something that sat heavy. The future wasn't coming to challenge me. It was waiting for me to move first. And that meant every step I took now wasn't just for survival. It was instruction. Somewhere behind that calm face, a plan was forming that didn't require my permission. And that made the next part unavoidable. Because when the student stops watching, it means he's ready to act. I decided to teach one last lesson. Not publicly, not dramatically. Quiet lessons last longer. I let certain doors open for him, not enough to crown him, enough to see what he'd do with access. He moved carefully, too carefully for a man chasing power. He fixed problems before they were visible. Smoothed conflicts without claiming credit. Let other men believe they were still in charge. That's discipline, but discipline cuts both ways because men like that don't stop. they refine. I realized then this wasn't about succession. It was about replacement, not my name, my method. So I made a move that looked like retreat. I stepped back from a key connection, let it float. He didn't grab it, he waited. That wait told me he wasn't impatient, which meant he was dangerous. That night my wife asked me something she hadn't asked in years. Are you done fighting? I didn't answer right away, because the truth was harder than pride. I wasn't fighting anymore. I was deciding how much of myself to leave behind, and whether the man learning from my silence would respect the weight of it. The city felt different once I stopped pushing against it. Not weaker, just lighter. That's when loneliness shows up, not as sadness, as space. Men stopped needing me for decision. They came for confirmation instead. That's the beginning of the end. I watched the younger man navigate rooms I once owned, not copying me, improving me. That should have made me angry. It didn't. It made me tired. I'd spent my life making sure chaos never outran me. Now chaos had manners. That's progress. Or erasure. One evening I stood at the window again, same as always, and realized something final. If I stayed visible, I'd slow him down. If I disappeared completely, I'd create a vacuum. Either way, someone would bleed, so I chose the third option. I gave him one piece of truth, not advice, not warning. Just context, enough to let him know the cost of mistakes, enough to remind him that power remembers who built the road it's walking on. He nodded once. Didn't thank me. Good. That's when I knew he'd learned the most important rule. Gratitude is weakness in this world. As he walked away, I felt it settle. This wasn't passing the crown. It was stepping out of the frame. And once you do that, you don't get to decide how the picture ends. I faded the way I always said I would. No announcement, no farewell, just fewer appearances, shorter days, longer nights. The city didn't panic. That told me everything. Harlem kept breathing. Deals kept moving. Men kept choosing. That was the proof. I'd built something that could survive my absence. But survival doesn't mean mercy. From a distance, I watched the new rhythm take hold. Cleaner, colder, less sentimental. The younger man moved like a surgeon now. No wasted motion, no unnecessary noise. I recognized myself in him. And that's when I understood the final cost. Legacy doesn't preserve you, it replaces you. Some nights I still feel the city watching, not with fear, with memory. That's enough. Because power was never about being remembered. It was about control while you're here. And I controlled my exit. Somewhere, a new game is being played using rules I helped write. And somewhere else, a man is learning the same lesson I learned too late. That the quietest endings are the ones nobody can stop. And that's how it should be.